It is the season of strikes in Kenya, like we told you in the first half of the program. Public university lecturers on strike, teachers and doctors as well. Everybody's worried about this, and the Kenya Private Sector Alliance has come out to say this sets a dangerous precedent and the economy cannot afford this. KEPSA CEO Carole Kariuki is now with me. What does the private sector think about this season of strikes?
It's a very hard time for the private sector because it has impact on the private sector because it just affects how everything runs, and that really influences the decisions of the private sector, especially those who are investors who are looking into investment, both local and international. They just feel the environment is not stable because what next in the country? And once you have your key sectors going on strike, who next? Yes. And so it's not a good situation. It's not a good time. The timing is also not right because it's election time when already the private sector is very wary about investment in the country because of just the last few times, and of course the climax being the 2007. So it's a worrying time for the private sector.
And it's interesting you're mentioning the election because there's almost a trend we can plot here. Every time we have an election coming up, then people know it's time to go on strike, especially in the public service, because it appears that's the only time the government is listening.
It's very unfair. I think it's very unfair for Kenyans that it's almost, we've learned that government does its goodies, almost, just the way they do their campaigns and dish money. Yes. It's almost the same thing they do on policies and things that really affect majority of Kenyans, especially the big sectors like the teachers and the doctors. So it's unfair for the Kenyans to know that they'll only get something during election time. At the same time, there are those who've learned to take advantage of that. So while I sympathize with the teachers because this was a promise made, something that was gazetted 15 years ago. So they do have a right to demand their rights. But at the same time, how much of that right can we demand at a go? And is it because if you don't get it now to mean another 5 years? So it's a very tricky balance, both for the government, but also I sympathize with this sector, the doctors and the teachers, where they realize we don't get anything until it's election time.
But the issues those on strike raise are well and truly justified. You're in the private sector and you have to pay competitively to be able to survive. But the government is the largest employer and those who work for it sometimes feel they're ignored in the scheme of things. How do we deal with these wider issues?
I think that we need to start looking at a change of policy, how we deal with the whole issue of teachers and doctors. My personal view would be, and this I'm sure the unions will not like this, is maybe start to include the teachers and the doctors in the mainstream civil service grading system, where they are graded as part of the civil service, so that when their wage increases for a certain grade, then that grade gets increased for. Yes. But it would also mean having to put them on performance contracting, and I don't know how government would do that with teachers and doctors.
Exactly. How would you judge, let's say, a teacher in a rural part of the country in Siaya with one in Nairobi who has all the resources, or say a doctor based on what the number of deaths prevented?
Yeah, it would be very hard. I think that's a challenge for government, but at the same time, they do have civil servants who are out in the rural versus those in Nairobi, and yes, all of them are in performance contracting. So maybe I'm sure there's some way we can find this, but we have to find a solution. We can't do this every 5 years. We have statistics that every 5 years this country goes through a drought, and it's not the rain drought. It's a drought in terms of how the economy runs. So that the economy will rise up to even 5%. Elections come and we dip down to 2%, 0, almost go to the negatives. And we can't sustain that. Kenya cannot achieve Vision 2030 if we continue to do that. And so this is just part of the things that we need to start looking at. But having said that, I think even as a country to prioritize and say what are some of the basic society's key sectors that we need to look at, and not just an issue of wages. I think wages is one thing. Yes. There's a lot more to look at in terms of what those sectors need, in terms of facilities and equipment, because you could pay a doctor 3 times, 4 times they're earning now. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the means to get to work and all that. So that still doesn't solve the problem. So I think it's also as a country to look at priorities and where we put our money in terms of the budgeting process. Where does our most money go to in terms of this in these sectors? Because they really hold the foundation of the economy. Because once you have well taken care of teachers, doctors, including the police, the security system, really feeds into the rest of the sectors, because as a private sector, then we get better employees who are healthy, well educated, so it does have a ripple effect that is positive if we start looking at those sectors. So it's important to do that.
What is the likely economic impact of this if these strikes continue, the teachers are not working, so schools are closed, public universities are closed, hospitals are almost on a go slow? I'm sure you've given some thought to the economic impact of this.
We've thought about it. I don't have the numbers right now, but I think it's something we'll definitely look to have numbers. But what it does is that other sectors also realize we can down our tools. And this will also start impacting in private sector. You'll start finding in private sector, the big companies, people also downing their tools and thinking, you know what, it's time also for us to down our tools because we can all agitate about this.
So there's a dangerous precedent there.
It's a dangerous precedent, and so we need to find a way to stop it, address issues long before election time. But also, it's time we started looking at cost to live vis-a-vis cost of living. Because as long as we look at cost of living, wages will always be what we think is the solution from the consumption side, which is very expensive from the production side. Because what will we see when that happens and the wages continue to rise? Already labor is becoming very expensive in Kenya. Private sector will move out of this country. We're in a regional integration, so not only the international investors, but also local investors will start leaving the country to go into the rest of the region because of labor cost. But when we start looking at cost to living, then we start looking at what are those things that make life very difficult, and we start addressing them. We start looking at energy, access to credit, all those different things, and addressing them. Then becomes much harder, so that when we bring wages as one of that, it doesn't become the only thing to resolve cost of living, but it becomes one of the things that we need to address. At the same time, we do have a tripartite of COTU, FKE, the Ministry of Labor. I think it's time we really took seriously to apply the laws, the wages laws and all that, so that there's the statistics that are based on when we increase wages and by how much with the growth of the economy. So it's not arbitrary.
Finally, from a policy perspective, what are you telling the government? What does government need to know in terms of how to deal with this in future to avoid situations like these?
From the government perspective, I think that's the first thing, prioritize your sectors. Secondly, start thinking about these sectors. How do they fit into the public service, into the civil service? And when they fit in, how do you want to go to put them into the grading system of the civil service? Do you want to, if they're special categories, how do you treat them so that we don't have this recurrence? Then also just making it very hard for politicians to make promises during election time. So that we say during election time, either politicians are bad or government is bad to make promises that it knows it will not keep. So that everything that is made, whatever is committed, is based on research and statistics, and it's within the period of government running within the 5 years.